Today's edition of MacVoices is sponsored by Drobo, a family of safe, expandable, yet simple-to-use storage arrays. Visit drobo.com/MacVoices and use the offer code VOICES100 for special pricing for MacVoices viewers and listeners. And by the MacVoices Dispatch, our weekly newsletter to stay up to date on all the MacVoices news. Subscribe from our front page or at macvoices.com/newsletter. Welcome back to MacNotables on MacVoices. This is the Talk of the Mac community. I'm Chuck Joyner. Folks, we are getting toward the end of our 10th anniversary celebration of the MacNotables. And for this show, I get to say 4 words that I never thought I would get to say on the show again. And I'm delighted that I can. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Breen.
Hey! Hi, how are you, Chuck?
Chris, it's great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. It's nice to be seen. I haven't done a podcast in a very long time, so I hope I remember how to do it.
I kind of think it's like riding a bike. You know, you'll be right back on it. No question.
We'll see.
So first off, thank you from me to you for 10 years of supporting MacNotables, being a regular guest, even though it's gone back and forth as far as frequency. But it's kind of amazing that it's 10 years that we've been at this.
Yeah, it is remarkable. I've been looking at your Twitter feed and looking at some of the people who've resurfaced, because when you started this, podcasting was happening, but it was kind of, early days. And I know when you put this together and said, hey, here's a wacky idea. Let's get people who talk about Apple and have them all on a podcast to talk about Apple. It's like, ooh, this is sort of new. And now this is so common. But you were one of the pioneers doing this. And it's nice to see some of these old names and faces come back and talk about this stuff. So I've just been thrilled.
Well, and it's funny. People ask me kind of, how it evolved over time. And I know for a while I was dealing with some family issues, that had to take priority. And I think that's where it started to fade out a little bit, because we used to throw out the ideas of let's do this, let's do that. And everybody was in for, once a week, twice a week. And then everybody, kind of branched off. They started doing their own things, which was completely understandable. And so as it developed, it slowed down quite a bit. So, but I'm just delighted that you're able to make it back, and we get to have a little conversation about one of your other careers. Because you have so many that I lose track.
Well, now I have basically 2, so we're going to talk about the other one.
Well, maybe right now, but over time there have been a lot of them.
Yeah.
But this one, and I guess this is maybe, well, you may have 3 right now. But I want to talk about the career as a podcast music producer, because I think that's very interesting. And of course, the third career I was referring to is you are also a professional musician outside of everything else. So we have the podcast audio, Chris Breen. We have the performing musician, Chris Breen. So that's. I wonder how. I'm anxious to find out kind of how one informs the other, if it does at all.
Sure.
So, how did you get started in podcast music creation?
It started with you.
Oh,
that's it.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be, because it's been great. I think this started when you were talking about doing this very podcast, and you knew I was a musician because you'd seen me play at Macworld All-Star Band during the long-lost Macworld Expo. And I think it was a pitch along the lines of, hey, would you like to do a podcast theme for me? And I thought, sure. And sat down and, as I recall, delivered something completely unexpected. You were thinking something like, oh, do this. And I did the opposite, which is sort of my nature anyway. And that was the podcast theme for MacNotables for a while. And I think because of that, when Macworld was doing its podcasts, and I took over podcasting duties for them, I thought, well, I like the podcast theme they were using, but I think maybe I'll just personalize a little bit more. So I created a podcast theme for that. And then once Jason Snell got the idea that I could actually do this stuff, who was running Macworld at the time, he started asking me to do other podcast themes. So IDG had the Clockwise podcast that Jason now has, and I did the podcast theme for that. And then when Jason started his incomparable network of podcasts, and other podcasts that he was involved in, he'd come back to me and say, hey, I need a theme. Would you be interested in doing it for me? And I said, sure, because I thought it was an interesting challenge. And that's kind of how this thing has rolled along.
You talked about what I suggested and then what you delivered, and you're right. It was not quite as opposite as it possibly could be, but it was in there. It's in their pitching. And by the way, folks, if everything goes well, I intend to, for this episode only, bring that music back as the intro, so you can hear some of Chris's work. Chris, you're a keyboard player primarily. I think you have some other skills. So is that why and how you kind of compose, or do you think about using other instruments? And again, not being a musician, I'm not quite sure how to ask it, but where do you start with something like this?
Well, I am a keyboard player primarily. I mean, I play the Appalachian dulcimer, which just about anybody can, and I also have a Chapman stick, which is a 10-string instrument that's bizarre, that I play very poorly, but I like the instrument just because it's so interesting. So mostly when you're talking about doing podcast themes, you think about what the podcast is about. Now, in the case of MacNotables, I early on thought, okay, this is about technology, and technology has certain expected themes that go with it. For example, if I were composing something for a Robin Hood show, you would have dun 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 dun, galloping horses kind of sounds and horns and that sort of thing. And for technology, it tends to be a lot of sequence stuff, which means repeated patterns of notes, or to musicians, it's an ostinato pattern. So, and you sort of think of high-tech kind of sounds, which tend to be very trebly, buzzy in some cases. So part of it is you think about the texture of the tones you're going to use and see how appropriate they are for that particular theme. Again, the character of the thing, what is it about? And then you sort of start picking out musical cliches. I mean, that's the easiest way to go about it. Sometimes you work entirely against whatever the theme is because it's going to work better for you. For example, Jason has another podcast on a different thing about space exploration. And what you would think is you would do a Star Wars or Star Trek kind of thing, the big horns, and what you're expecting, this huge clangorous sound, because that's the way we're accustomed to seeing space operas play out. But for that one, I used a very simple piano theme with a little reverb on it. The idea being, I was trying to put myself in a space where I thought, well, what would it be like? What would be the emotional feeling of being in space? Well, it's vast and it's lonely. And so that particular piece, I kept very quiet, extremely simple. And I think it was much more effective because of that. I turned it into Jason at the time, and he kind of went, gee, this is kind of sad. I said, true, it is sad, but being in space is kind of sad. I mean, when you think of how insignificant you are and how large the space is, but at the same time, how dramatic it is. Maybe something simple but heartfelt would work well here. And I think it did go well. I got a very good response to it. People liked the theme a lot. And I think it worked with that particular show. So that's an example of going against the theme. But most of the time, you think about what it's about and then compose accordingly.
It's fascinating to listen to you talk about it. I think back to the MacNotables theme and the first time that I opened up that file and played it. And over time, I came to understand that it was much better. It was a much better fit than anything that I would have probably anticipated or expected or requested, because of the, like you say, the rhythms, it fit the tone of the show. As much fun as we've always had, there's always been a bit of serious consideration in the discussions. And yeah, it's as I was listening to you talk about it, the word thoughtful came to mind. It's like, okay, that music is almost thoughtful. And at least that's, now again, trying to relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, I think it's intentional. I tend to be a very emotional player, and I don't mean that I'm weeping when I play or that I'm, I make a lot of faces or anything, but as I grew up playing, people would comment that I tended to be a very romantic player. And what that means in music is that, like Glenn Gould, for example, is a very famous pianist who was considered to be a very bizarre pianist for the reason that he would play Bach instead of the traditional way to play Bach is very straight, very rhythmic. You don't modify the tempo very much at all. You play pretty much what's on the page. And he would go all over the place and take liberties with tempo all the time, so that he'd speed up in certain passages and he'd slow down and do extremes of volume as he was playing. And plus, worse yet, he's sort of humming in the background, which is very distracting. But that's what I mean by romantic, is that you take a lot of liberties with the music. You tend to alter the volume quite a bit and speed up and slow down. So you play with the phrasing, much like an actor would delivering lines. So that comes through in what I compose as well. I'm very much a melody guy. Jazz players can be riff guys, or they can be scale guys, or women as well. But I tend to go for melody because that's what I understand. I don't understand riffs a lot of times, and I don't have a lot of scales in my back pocket to pull out. So many of my themes tend to be very melody-oriented, and then where I can find an emotional element, and I'll put it in, even though it's not always appropriate. I think for, like, if you're doing a very techno, like a tech-sounding theme, there's still an emotional element in there because that's what drives me as a musician. So I almost can't help doing it.
This edition of MacVoices is sponsored by Drobo, a family of safe, expandable, yet simple-to-use storage arrays that are designed to protect your important data forever. Visit drobo.com/MacVoices and use the offer code VOICES100 for special pricing for MacVoices viewers and listeners. As I've mentioned before, Drobo is my choice for safe, simple-to-use storage that does so much more. This time, let's dig into a few details that make a Drobo, and not just another hard drive case or RAID array. RAID array. RAID is geek speak for a redundant array of inexpensive disks. There are lots of different RAIDs. Some are for speed, some are for redundancy. One disk mirrors what's on the other disk, so you have two copies should something go wrong. But Drobo has beyond RAID. Some key features are that you can start with just 2 drives and add more as you go without having to go back and do any work or preparation. That you can mix and match drive sizes and manufacturers. That's something you can't do with traditional RAIDs. That you can swap out a smaller drive and replace it with a larger one when you need more space, again, with no work or preparation on your part. Drobo handles it all for you. And of course, protection from data loss should a drive fail. Or if you choose, from 2 drives failing at the same time. Drobos have a battery-backed cache where it holds data before it's written to disk to make sure you don't lose data in case of a power outage. In fact, there's an internal eUSB device which holds data even longer in case there's an extended power outage, as well as a special journaling system to help prevent data loss in that situation. In short, if the power goes out when you're using your Drobo, you won't lose that data. Your Drobo can also be outfitted with the solid-state drive hot data cache, which accelerates some data operations, especially important for photo and database work. If you're using Apple's Photos or Adobe's Lightroom with your Drobo, you're going to definitely want that. Now, that's a whole lot of detail for something I keep telling you is simple, so let me boil it down for you. 1. You can start with just 2 drives in your Drobo and grow from there. 2. You can add or upgrade your Drobo just by sliding a new drive into an empty bay or swapping a smaller drive out for a larger drive, so your Drobo can grow with you. 3. You don't need to worry about what size drive is where or who made it. Drobo can handle whatever 3.5-inch drive you throw at it. 4. If you want to do more with your Drobo, there are all sorts of applications to extend its usefulness. 5, and the bottom line, your data is safe. If you didn't hear my story about my recent data loss and recovery adventures, go back and watch or listen to MacVoices number 15194 and find out why I strongly recommend Drobo for your data storage needs. There are lots of Drobo models to choose from to address all your needs. Some are USB 3.0 attached and Thunderbolt attached, some are network attached. And right now you can save $100 on the Drobo Mini, Drobo 4-Bay, or Drobo 5N by visiting drobo.com/MacVoices and using the code VOICES100. That's voices in all caps, 100. I have several Drobos that have been in service for years, and I have never lost any data stored in any of my Drobos. I want you to have that same peace of mind. So visit drobo.com/MacVoices, get yours, and save $100 on the Drobo Mini, Drobo 4-Bay, or Drobo 5N. Thanks to Drobo for keeping my data safe and for their support of MacVoices. I also was intrigued by your statements about sort of what is expected and whether you decide to play with that or play against it. And the Robin Hood is a great example. It's like, yeah, I can kind of, yeah, that makes perfect sense. The space thing going the other direction was also a great example. But trying, I don't completely understand the process of how you go about deciding what music would sound right for a particular situation. I'm thinking of the clockwise theme. Mm-hmm. The clockwise theme, of course, makes perfect sense. Ticking and clanging, and the clock sounds basically with a little something behind it. But trying to figure out some of the other more abstract things, are you one of those people that sees or hears kind of a melody or a rhythm to pretty much anything you see, and it just sometimes has to come out?
A little. I have absolute pitch, or what we used to call perfect pitch, which is less than perfect now. And it turns out there's a physiological thing that happens when you're 50. Your ear changes, the mechanics of your ear change in such a case that people that have perfect pitches, once they turn 50 or so, their pitch goes off, and it's usually by a half step. And I don't know why this is, but I looked it up on Stanford because they were doing a lot of research into this stuff. And I used to just nail tones. I could hear somebody could bang a frying pan. I could tell you what pitch that was, or I hear a train go by, and I could tell you what, how the pitch changed over time and which two notes were part of that. So having that kind of ear does influence sort of what you expect from the beginning of a melody. So I can sometimes start something and then go, well, okay, I know where this is going to go logically, because melodies do tend to have patterns, so that you'll jump up this certain interval, and then the next expected note may be this one. So in some cases, it's just a matter of starting and then following the path to the logical conclusion. The difficulty of that is sometimes it just becomes trite because you're doing exactly what's expected. So sometimes you want to look for the thing that's going to be emotional, everybody's expecting you to hit this note, but you don't. Instead of going to the minor key, you go to the major key, or the other way around. For non-musicians, it's a little hard to explain what that means, but if you pay attention to music that moves you beyond merely volume, and say, well, what happened there that made me suddenly choke up? And sometimes it's simply a matter of you're expecting one thing and you get a different thing, but yet it still works for you.
I've had this discussion with visual artists and people that create visually, that I know what I like, but I don't always know why. Mm. And I've been fortunate to have some people try to teach me a little bit about why I like certain things. Sometimes I buy the explanation, sometimes I'm not quite so sure, but usually they can prove that they are right by saying, okay, take me somewhere, show me a piece of art or an object or something, and say, okay, you're going to like this, and I do, or you're not. I know you're not going to like this, and I don't. And so it's intriguing, and as someone who doesn't completely understand it, I'm always trying to get into the heads of those people to understand, so that I can understand why I like something, and therefore develop whatever skills or. I don't even know why I want to know that, but I just want to know it. And the same thing with music is what it sounds like. I know the kind of things I like. I know the kind of things I like, but I don't know exactly why.
Yeah, because it's an interesting mix. Part of it is craft, and that's just simply knowing your tools and how to use them, like anything. But there's a certain magical element to it as well, so that you know the rules and you're supposed to do this, but you find instances where you break them to your advantage, that you do have the unexpected. And sometimes the unexpected is jarring in such a way that you don't like it, or it's delightful because you weren't expecting. It's the surprise element of it that you may think, yeah, I've heard this. Oh, and it's And it really is that immediate where it just kind of gets to you and chokes you up or makes you smile or in the case of heavy metal, makes you angry or whatever it is that was supposed to happen. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. As a keyboard player, I would think that you have the opportunity to explore a lot more than, say, a guitarist or something, because there's so many things now that you can plug into your keyboard and get different sounds and all. Is that something you have explored a lot and do a lot, or do you tend to stick with a traditional keyboard organ kind of sound?
When I'm playing live, I'm increasingly going with traditional sounds. So, because I play in a rhythm and blues band or a big Americana band that I play with Paul Kent. In that case, I do a lot of piano, accordion, and organ. When I'm doing podcast stuff, the main project that I'm doing now is Jason Snell's Incomparable Radio Theater. And this is to mimic an old-time radio show, even though there's some modern elements in it. And it's very geeky and it's very pop culture-y and a lot of nerd jokes in it. David J. Lohr writes the thing. It's great. I mean, his writing is just superb. So in those cases, I'm really writing within a genre and performing within a genre. So there will be a segment that is going to be a 30s noir takeoff. So it's I have to work within a certain vocabulary for that. So the idea is David will say, okay, we're going to do this thing. It's going to be a 30s noir detective character. What do you got? So in that case, this was for the doll tear sheet theme. What he really wanted was a saxophone lead. Well, it turns out that when you're using synthesized saxophones, they sound awful. And it's not because people aren't sampling them well, but the saxophone is more like the human voice than anything else. And unless you're using a breath controller with your synthesizer, which allows you to trigger notes by blowing into this thing, which is a tricky technique that I don't do well, your saxophone ends up just sounding cheesy and not real. So I've tended to go with clarinet instead, because the synthesizer, I use Logic from Apple, and a lot of their synthesized instruments, and their clarinet is quite good. So for that, I'm looking at a basic trap set with brushes, a stand-up bass, piano, because again, it's a traditional sound, and then the clarinet, which gives you kind of, and this is really in the bass clarinet range, where you've got that still kind of breathy, sexy, dark tone that immediately brings you into that environment. And a lot of what I do is try to enhance the environment that they're trying to replicate. So if they've got something that's Doctor Who-ish, I use that kind of instrument selection. In this case, this 30s noir, I'm using something where people would say, oh yeah, that totally fits within that genre that they're trying to reproduce within the radio drama.
Now, when you're talking about the stand-up bass and all of that, are you doing all that with the keyboards, or do you actually reach out to everything is keyboard based? Everything
is me and Logic. So there'll be some cases, Logic unfortunately doesn't have a jazz drummer. They have these drummers, and the technology is amazing. They've managed to create these drummers that will react to other tracks that you've created. So it's just astonishingly intelligent. But they don't have a jazz drummer. So for jazz tracks, because I'm a lousy drummer, I have to depend on loops for that stuff. So Apple within Logic has a large collection of loops, and they have some jazz loops in there. So for jazz tracks, which can be swing or the doll tear sheet stuff is kind of more walking bass, slower stuff. I'll pull that in as the basis for it. Then I'll do a bass track on top of it using a standard bass, and I play that. And then I'll play the keyboard part, which is usually a piano. And then sometimes I have the melody ready, but oftentimes I'm doing the chord pattern first. And then I've got the rest of the band going in the tracks, and then I just overdub a part. And oftentimes I'll play something over and over and over again, trying different variations, and eventually I distill down to the theme that I want to use. In the case of the early Incomparable podcasts, these were originally one-offs. They were kind of special April Fool's kind of things. For the first one we did, I'd composed a theme for the Incomparable podcast. So everything I did in that show was a variation on that theme, which I'd hoped would be hidden enough so that people would really have to listen and then finally go, oh, that's the same theme over and over again, except it's done as a swing tune. It's done as a classical Baroque tune. It's done as a, we had a country Western theme. And it took some of the people on the podcast about 3 listens before they went, oh, I get it. So sometimes there are musical jokes included in this stuff that if you know a certain little musical tidbit, you understand that's in there and I'm playing off something.
I realize this is almost an impossible question, but how long does it take you to compose? Let's say I called you tomorrow and said, hey, Chris, I'm doing a new show and I want a theme for it. And so I described the show to you so you can get some sort of the feel that you talked about earlier. How long would it take you to come up with something typically?
It depends on the project, but usually it's a couple of hours because I'm working during the week and I don't have time to do it then. So this is always stuff that I jam into the weekends. And oftentimes I know that I've got 3 things that I need to do for the next version of, next episode that's coming out. So some things come very quickly. And if they're very simple, if it's just a little sting or something, meaning, just a little action bit, that doesn't take long. If it's a new theme for something, it can take a couple of hours. So that's mostly coming up with the idea, recording it, mixing it, and then shoving it out the door.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I love talking to creative people just to try to find out how they think and what their process is. And it sounds like yours, obviously, with the experience you've had as a professional musician, you don't have to think about the technical parts of the piano and all that. It's just more seat of the pants, gut feeling as to what you want it to come out like.
Yeah, a lot of it is. When you're trying to replicate a style that you're not comfortable with, that takes a little longer because you have to analyze what's going on in the piece and then try to replicate it without stealing it. Oftentimes David will say, here, I want something like this. And they go, oh, great. Okay, well, that's stuck in my head now. For example, he for the podcast theme for it, the Incomparable Radio Theater always starts with the same little thing. And he gave me 2 examples, and one of them was a Duke Ellington song. And so what I was able to do is steal the instrumentation from that and say, okay, well, this is the kind of band we want. But then I had to completely put everything else out of my mind so that I wasn't ripping off Duke Ellington. Or he'll say something like, oh, I want something like the Peter Gunn theme. Which one? Oh, okay, so let's see, one of the most famous themes ever. And you want something like that, but doesn't sound like I've just stolen that. So that part you have to look at the specific parts that are going to convey that kind of feeling without ripping somebody else off.
You just said something else interesting to me that's the kind of band that we want. I wouldn't have thought of it in those terms. And I guess if I pull back just a second, okay, you have the music I tend to like. You have power trios, and then you have 2 guitars, bass, drums, and maybe a vocalist or maybe not. And then you throw something like Deep Purple in, where you have a big organ presence. So you start to understand that I guess the composition, and you were saying earlier about the clarinets and the saxes and all. I never thought about the fact that different bands would approach something differently.
Yeah, well, and again, you have to look at what people are expecting, and that's part of it. Is all the texture that they expect from this kind of thing. Like if I'm doing a Star Trek theme, I was one of the podcasts I did is for it's a Star Trek talk show. So in that case, I actually did sort of steal the Star Trek theme. I turned it inside out and backwards. But again, you have to look at how did they do that? Well, this is the orchestra they used, and these are the instruments they featured. What becomes challenging in this is, as I talked about the saxophone earlier, you have to think about what sounds you have at your command and then understand some that don't work very well, because you have to, if your backup band is supposed to be all horns and it sounds cheesy, and yet it's supposed to sound like it came from the 1940s, that's not going to work. So you have to look for compromises where you can convey that and yet work around the limitations of your tools.
One last thing before we go, and that is we've talked a lot, I think, about the instrumentation and all that. But on the software side, you mentioned Logic. This has got to be a kind of an exciting time for someone like you to do these projects on the side as almost fun projects because of the capabilities you have with the software that is available now.
It is. I've been using sequencers and digital audio workstations for a long time. And before I used Opcode's Vision, and I've used Performer's Mark of the Unicorn. And I picked up GarageBand several years ago when it first came out because I was really excited by it. Now I'm using Logic, and Logic has got to be the best bargain out there. The thing, it doesn't cost very much. It's a couple of $100. They provide you with a great library of sounds. It's really easy to use, particularly if you're moving up from GarageBand. Logic used to be a real challenge to use. It was probably the most difficult DAW to use, but Apple, since it acquired it from eMagic, has done a tremendous job simplifying it and making it easier for normal people to use. So I haven't added much to it. I got my own digital piano specific Steinway plugin that I use for solo stuff because it just sounds tremendous. But I've got this wonderful palette of tools to use. They're easy tools to use. Mixing is pretty easy. So I think what I used to do and the amount of money and time I spent recording on a 4-track recorder and bouncing tracks back and forth and all the machinations you'd have to go through. And things much like doing video at home now are so much easier and so less expensive. And it's exactly the same in music. You don't have to go out and spend a bunch of money in a recording studio. You can produce professional quality stuff with a computer and, in my case, a keyboard and an interface, and I'm set. So that's one reason I like doing this stuff is it gives me a chance to play with these tools and exercise a part of my brain that parts of which I haven't touched for a long time.
I think I can understand that part. That because I know friends that from when we were kids, and they had bands and they would record, then they would dub something over and record the two together, and what you ended up with was okay, you could say it was a song, but it was also a hissy mess. Right. It was amazing. And now what can be done with really even on an iPad at this point is fascinating because of the software. So, Chris, does this mean that we might see you occasionally talking about different creative topics? Is that a possibility, or
in what respect?
I don't know. you set the guidelines, and but
yeah, I mean, as long as we don't talk about my work, I'm happy to talk about my hobbies, and this is certainly one of them, and my avocations. When I referred earlier to using part of my brain that I don't normally use, one of the things I thought I should mention is that I've had to arrange a couple of choral pieces with me as the only vocalist. So I'm recording 8 tracks of myself, and I'm not a great singer, but a couple of things in this podcast required it. And that meant that I had to go back about 35 years to my choral scoring class in college and remember how to arrange voices. So revisiting that has been very interesting and trying to recall how to do it and start looking through my old textbooks again. So yeah, I like talking about this stuff because I think the way the creative mind works is fascinating. And I think I always like watching other people work, so that where I see somebody do something that I think is magic, I love to actually watch them do what they do and realize that there's technique behind it, there's experience behind it. See how they build something that to me seems magical when in a lot of cases it's not. It's architecture and skill. So sure, I love talking about creative stuff.
Well, I love hearing about it because, again, it gives me a chance to start to understand a little bit more. I usually come away from these things, you're here and I'm here. But by the end of the show, maybe I'm here. So I get something out of it, and I hope the folks do too, because I think it is interesting. What can I say, Chris? 10 years, thanks so much. Thanks for coming back and talking about this, and we hope to talk to you again soon in the future.
Good. Thanks for having me.
Great. Folks, I'm Chuck Joyner. This is MacNotables on MacVoices, 10-year anniversary for both shows. We really appreciate you being here, and we will be back again soon. Thanks for watching. Visit MacVoices.com for links, show notes, to subscribe, to connect with Chuck on Twitter, Google+, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and the MacVoices blog. Subscribe to our weekly newsletter, the MacVoices Dispatch, to stay up to date on all the latest MacVoices news from our front page or at MacVoices.com/newsletter. Do more with your Apple tech by subscribing to the free MacVoices magazine on Flipboard by visiting MacVoices.com/magazine. Advertising and sponsorships handled by Backbeat Media at backbeatmedia.com. Bandwidth provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.